A key tenet of not only anarchism but traditional socialism is that the means of production should be under the democratic control of the workers. For example, during the Industrial Revolution in the United States, the Lowell mill girls took the view that those who work in the mills should own them, rather than be ruled by private despots trampling on democratic rights, a typical socialist position. In this video, I want to outline how the Bolshevik Revolution failed because the institutions of workers' control were undermined and dismantled, and how the state undertook the role of the private despot. The Factory Committees. In March 1917, after the February Revolution, workers took the opportunity to create their own organisations, factory and shop committees, whose demands weren't limited to wages and hours, but were beginning to challenge the premises of capitalism. These popular organisations were a significant threat to the system. The capitalist press launched a smear campaign against them in May, claiming that the workers were lazy and that their demands were excessive. At this point, Lenin called for the unconditional participation of the workers in the control of industry, and said that that could be brought about by a decree requiring but a single day to draft. In other words, from above. This foreshadowed much of what followed. In August, the Provisional Government launched a campaign against the factory committees in the railways. In October, factory committees were springing up all over the place, and there was the first all-Russian conference of factory committees. One Bolshevik speaker at this conference stated that the growth of the influence of the factory committees has naturally occurred at the expense of centralised economic organisations of the working class, such as the trade unions. This, of course, is a highly abnormal development which has, in practice, led to very undesirable results. This also foreshadowed much of what followed, as trade unions would later be used as a means of repressing the workers. Bolsheviks were on the verge of seizing power at this point, but were already beginning to oppose the factory committees. Lenin's statement that we must change our slogan, and instead of saying all power to the Soviets, we must say all power to the factory committees, highlights the political opportunism of the Bolsheviks. They wanted to exploit the popular interest in the factory committees and try to subordinate them to their own ends. The Bolsheviks in Power. The Bolsheviks took power on October the 25th, and the dismantling of workers' control began. Lenin published a decree on workers' control which became the beginnings of the economic bureaucracy. All of the enterprises deemed to be of state importance, which was conveniently defined as anything necessary for the masses' existence, were to be answerable to the state for the maintenance of the strictest order and discipline and for the protection of property. The factory committees were to be responsible to the regional councils of workers' control, and the regional councils were in turn subordinated to an all-Russian council of workers' control, and the upper councils were controlled by the Bolshevik Party. This is despite the fact that the factory committees had already been attempting to create their own national organisation. Isaac Deutscher said, "The Bolsheviks now called upon the trade unions to render a special service to the nascent Soviet state and to discipline the factory committees. The unions came out firmly against the attempt of the factory committees to form a national organisation of their own." So this wasn't an organic attempt at coordinating mass self-activity from the bottom up by means of federalism. This was being imposed from the top down. In late November, Bolshevik Larin stated that the factory committees should be subordinated to the trade unions. In December, the Supreme Economic Council was created, composed of union officials, members of the Bolshevik Party, and some members of the All-Russian Council. Organisations increasingly distant from the factory committees, that would direct the activities of all of the other organs of economic administration that had been created. At this point, Lenin openly admitted that we had passed from workers' control to the creation of the Supreme Council of National Economy, which was to replace, absorb, and supersede the machinery of workers' control. The bureaucracy of the state and the party had asserted itself over the workers. In January 1918, the first All-Russian Congress of Trade Unions was held in Petrograd, and the Bolshevik majority voted to subordinate the factory committees to the unions. Furthermore, it was established that the trade unions must go over each decree of the factory committees in the sphere of control, explain through their delegates at the factories and shops that control over production does not mean the transfer of the enterprise into the hands of the workers of a given enterprise, that it does not equal the socialization of production and exchange. The whole premise of socialism, that industry should be in the hands of the workers, was rejected. In March, a decree was published for centralisation and the end of workers' control of the railways. Recall the position taken by the capitalist provisional government in 1917 against the factory committees controlling the railways. In early April, the Cheka, the secret police organisation, raided 26 anarchist centres in Moscow. 40 anarchists were wounded or killed, and over 500 anarchists were imprisoned. Later in April, Lenin argued for the introduction of Taylorism, a capitalist method of micromanaging workers, and said that unquestioning submission to a single will is absolutely necessary for the success of labour processes that are based on large-scale machine industry. Today the revolution demands, in the interests of socialism, that the masses unquestioningly obey the single will of the leaders of the labour process. In June, a decree was issued in which the mining, metallurgical, textile, electrical, timber, tobacco, resin, glass and pottery, leather and cement industries, all steam-driven mills, local utilities and private railways, together with a few other minor industries, were nationalised and brought into the hands of the centralised state. In August, there was the first All-Russian Congress of Anarcho-Syndicalists, in which the Bolshevik government was accused of forsaking the factory committees and creating state capitalism in the name of socialism. The Supreme Economic Council that had been created was now firmly in the hands of the state. The workers were deprived of control over the economic decisions affecting their lives. The hierarchical relations of production that constitute class society were intact. In October, a decree was created enforcing that only the Supreme Economic Council has the authority to take possession of industries. In March 1919, there was the 8th Bolshevik Party Congress. It was again argued that the unions need to discipline the workers. The decline of the workers' councils was discussed. It was clear that they were, at this point, not playing a significant role in the control of production, but merely ratifying what had been decided by the party. In the 9th Party Congress in March 1920, Trotsky said that compulsion of labour will reach the highest degree of intensity in the transition from capitalism to socialism. Deserters from labour ought to be formed into punitive battalions or put into concentration camps. He also advocated the so-called progressive essence of Taylorism that Lenin had favoured earlier. The Congress called on the trade unions to explain to the workers that collective administration has to be maximally curtailed in favour of individual management in the name of industrial reconstruction. In 1921, there was the Kronstadt Rebellion. Workers were demanding basic civil liberties, freedom of speech in the press, freedom of assembly, the release of political prisoners, and the institution of mobile workers' control groups. The Bolsheviks crushed this uprising, killing thousands and sentencing people to years of forced labour. By this point, there had developed the workers' opposition within the Bolshevik Party, which was somewhat concerned with the bureaucratic apparatus that they had created. At the 10th Party Congress in March, Trotsky said that the workers' opposition had made a fetish of democratic principles. They have placed the workers' right to elect representatives above the party, as if the party were not entitled to assert its dictatorship, even if that dictatorship temporarily clashed with the passing moods of the workers' democracy. That the party dictatorship clashed with the so-called passing mood of basic socialist principles seemed to be of little concern. The contradictions between the elementary socialist idea of workers' control over production and the program of centralization that was being pursued by the Bolsheviks were becoming more and more apparent. The party could cope with individualized critiques of excess bureaucracy in particular organizations, but it could not tolerate those socialists who were criticizing the class nature of the state apparatus and questioning the basic legitimacy of the vanguard. Those ideas had to be driven out of people's heads. The Bolshevik press ran propaganda campaigns against the Makhnovists for this very reason. By 1922, a new economic policy was introduced of state capitalism, in which the nationalised industries were operating on a profit basis. There was no workers' control. There were hierarchical management structures in the relations of production, and the political ruling class was benefiting materially from that state of affairs given the for-profit operation. Not only that, but the workers were subjected to an authoritarian state that was attacking basic civil liberties. Socialism had been completely destroyed, anarchists were violently repressed, and the Bolsheviks had laid out the groundwork for the even more brutal Stalinism that would later follow. From an anarchist perspective, the destruction of socialism in Russia was a direct result of the strategy undertaken by the Bolsheviks of taking state power. Anarchists define the state as a centralised, hierarchical institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence over a geographical area governed by a class of professional rulers. When the Bolsheviks took state power, the class of professional rulers organised the economy in its own interests by dismantling the institutions of workers' control and establishing state capitalism. Bolsheviks claim that taking state power is justified on the grounds that a socialist strategy requires defending against counter-revolutionary forces. But given the history of dismantling socialist institutions, they're not defending against the counter-revolution, they are the counter-revolution. The Bolshevik strategy is not only ineffective, but actively destructive towards socialism. A class-free society will not emerge by creating authoritarian relations of production and destroying workers' control. Leninists often try to justify some or all of the above by claiming that it was necessary to achieve rapid industrialization. Whether the same or better could have been achieved in the same time frame by an anarchist economic system is not known, given that we can't turn back the clock and see what would have happened if the factory committees had launched a libertarian revolution. For now, suffice it to say that the human cost of Bolshevism was very significant. Stalinism was just a more extreme continuation of what had already been put in place. Secret police and gulags were already there. The state was not only anti-socialist, but totalitarian. Leninists hate that word being used to describe their system because it's also been used to describe fascism, and they seem frightened of it being exposed that, in terms of the authority that the state possessed over the individual, their system was almost as monstrous. The fact of rapid industrialization doesn't justify that oppressive system. Secondly, central planning has a lot of problems. The producers and consumers themselves possess a far more intimate knowledge of their own needs than a small elite, and expecting that elite group of planners to make decisions that will effectively meet those varied needs is really questionable. Conclusion: left unity? In spite of this history, many people will ask, isn't it for the best that the entire left unites against the capitalists and we put our differences aside? What about left unity? To this, I would respond that it has been made clear historically that Leninists have a problem with working class autonomy and they thwart worker control. Because of this, Leninism becoming the norm, by definition, is a threat to a revolutionary movement for a class-free society. We aren't on the same team. If they are setting up hierarchical, state-run systems, they can only tolerate a certain degree of dissent. If we dissent beyond that degree, then we're breaching left unity. Those who want horizontal systems have to subordinate themselves to those who want hierarchical ones. Left unity means that they're in charge and we have to follow orders. Left unity means we're either not allowed to question the legitimacy of their authority, or if we do question the legitimacy of it, we're not allowed to act on that. The fact that they attacked self-management in Spain and that the Bolsheviks sent over 300,000 troops to destroy the Makhnevist movement in Ukraine has to be glossed over and forgotten about. I think left libertarian unity between those who want worker self-management but with different systems of distribution is practically feasible in the struggle against capitalism, though come the revolution, mutualists and anarcho-communists will have to go their separate ways and put their different systems into effect. However, the contradiction of interests between those who want a participatory system and those who want a state hierarchy with them at the top is just too great for there to be any practical value in cooperation between those groups, because under those circumstances, cooperation means obedience. If you're a socialist and you take the view of the Lowell Mill girls, that those who work in the mills should own them, then you should naturally oppose the Leninists who have said clearly that they reject the transfer of enterprises into the hands of the workers. Leninists want to create a political class, and the rhetoric about left unity is merely an attempt to cajole workers into collaborating with that political class. This video has been largely based on Maurice Brinton's pamphlet on the Bolsheviks and workers' control, which I highly recommend checking out as it gives a more complete timeline of events in the early years of the Russian Revolution than I have summarised here. Many thanks to my contributors on Patreon: Brandon Haukus Tischer, Comrade Dr. Fraser Crane, Cyclodeon, Deviath Fur, Drakur, Flagburner, Jack Bryant, Joe Martin, Comrade Klaus, Michael Norling, Patrick Gordon, Richard Pearson, Richard Rires, and XXX Swagmaster 420 XXX. This has been Libertarian Socialist Rants. Thanks for watching.